My love affair with Mount McKinley can easily be traced back to a single moment. In January 1936, Dr. Gilbert Grosvenor, then president of the National Geographic Society, asked if I knew of any unusually interesting geographical exploration that could be pulled off at not too great an expense. This unexpected challenge posed no problems to me. I had already read the thrilling stories of the exploration and conquest of Mount McKinley by Belmore Browne and Hudson Stuck. I had also learned to fly myself and had 7 years of experience in aerial photography among the big peaks of the Alps in the Alaska Coast Range. I proposed a micro-expedition to make the first large-format photographic flights over and around Mount McKinley, to be done at a cost not to exceed $1,000. Teaming up with the National Geographic and Pan American Airways, we made the flights in July 1936, and we sent back to Dr. Grosvenor some 200 8x10-inch photographs and a check for $37, the unexpended balance of that $1,000 grant. In the more than 60 years since that memorable summer, I've climbed McKinley 3 times and spent many, many months on and above its slopes, on snowshoes, on crampons, in tents, igloos, airplanes, and helicopters. Together with my wife, Barbara, and scores of lifelong friends, I'm come to hold his great peak and its beautiful but rugged approaches in deep affection, and at the same time in profound respect. We were lucky to climb it when we did. I was the 11th man on top, Barbara the first woman. We lived and climbed on the mountain as if it belonged to us. As of today, more than 10,000 people from all over the world have reached McKinley's summit. Almost exactly 1,000 try it each year, and almost exactly half of that number actually get to the top. But McKinley itself hasn't changed a whit. Just to be in its presence is still as exciting to me as it was the very first time I saw it. What are you climbing?
We're doing more of a travel route. We're going to try to go from the Pica over to the ramparts.
Yeah.
And then
Well, here we are in Talkeetna, Alaska. It's hard to believe since 1930. This is my 67th trip here, and we enjoy every one of them.
So when you relayed, did you relay up to the southeast fork then?
We love this little town of Talkeetna. It's at the epicenter of activity on Mount McKinley. If you hear a noise of an airplane, in the next few minutes it's either landing or taken off from bringing people to or from having ascended Mount McKinley, which is sort of interesting. Actually, the noise is what the excitement is in this place. Well, the origin of the 1947 climb, during which Barbara was the first girl to climb both peaks of Mount McKinley, June 6th and June 7th, 1947. Now that trip, you have to recollect, the purpose of this 1947, or one of the purposes of it, was to study cosmic rays. And we had a very fine guy called Hugo Victorine, who'd never climbed a mountain in his life. And we airdropped a little plywood house, 6 by 6 by 6. And he worked with Jim Gale and Shorty Lang, the three of them, for over 2 weeks of observations of cosmic radiation in that little shack.
You know, when you're on Mount McKinley back in those days, you were the only expedition on the mountain, and you felt pretty important and as if you were really doing something exciting. But coming down Carson's Ridge, I saw 3 little dots at the foot of the ridge as I was about halfway down. And I said to Brad, my gosh, I think there's somebody else coming up here, you know, that was unheard of. And sure enough, we got down there, and there were these 3 young men from the University of Alaska, and Brad was ahead of me, and he held out his arm and said, how do you do? And what's the name of the man, the explorer's name?
Yes, I said, as we approached them, I said, Dr. Livingston, I presume.
Yes.
The famous quote, you know.
Yes.
And the guy said, no, my name is Morton Woods. I come from Seattle.
So
that was
anyway,
a great.
We had a little conversation with them, and obviously they were going up the mountain after us because they knew we had big caches and a lot of extra food, and they were going to live on our stuff. But this was the first time that there'd ever been more than one party on the mountain.
This is a cold, cold, windy spot. Warmest nights up here in mid-July, later on, were 15 below zero or so, 20 below zero on a chilly night. Jim Gale made a wonderful remark. He said, the wind in Denali Pass never stops blowing except when it has to stop in order to start blowing the other way around. You don't find anybody up here with light clothing on, and rarely you see them with their parkas off. Hugo Victorine, University of Chicago, cosmic ray expert. We're putting together his little 6 by 6 by 6 research hut that was parachuted in here with all these supplies in it, carefully planned in advance for his cosmic ray research work, which was very, very successful. It's amusing to be doing research for the Office of Naval Research at 18,000 feet on the top of Alaska. For camp here, we had a couple of tents and a main tent and then a couple of igloos.
The day came for us to go to the summit, and I was on the rope with Bill Hackett and George Brown. And I was doing very well, in good shape. And they were dragging behind. They had headaches and everything, and Bill Hackett, I was having to pull all the time. Anyway, when we got toward the summit, Shorty Lang, I guess, was the lead man on the rope. And he said, now, Barbara, we're getting to the top. Now, you must step out first, because don't you know, you're the first woman to get here. And I said, oh, heck, that doesn't make any difference. We 3 will go on just as the way they are. We were. And so he said, no. He said, Barbara, you're making history. So you go ahead of me and step out first, which I did. But I did not have an emotional feeling when I got to the top like Brad did, and thinking it was his last time and weeping and all that. All I could think of was getting home to my kids safely. And Brad, I knew, had an hour's work of surveying, and the wind was blowing, it was, what, 20 below zero, and a lot of wind. And it was cold, so I didn't want to freeze my toes or freeze my feet. And I knew that going down was always harder than coming up because you're elated that you've made the top and you slip and you might make a mistake. So I was concentrating entirely on my own well-being and being safe. But I said to myself, boy, I'll never be here again. I better walk over to the edge and take a good look. And I did, and I looked at it as far as I could see, and I said, oh yes. When the first guys got up here, they said it looked like looking out the windows of heaven, and they were right. It looks just the way I imagined heaven when I was a little girl.
We have one time that is an untold story that's a beauty on the interrelationship between Barbara and me. On the way up, there was a very steep spot. This varies a good deal, but usually it's at around 12,700 feet on Karstens Ridge. And that year it was very, very icy. And I decided that I would cut a few steps off the ridge and then go steeply back up above it so that you wouldn't have to climb a vertical face that was about 40, 50 feet high. So I chopped steps up through black ice, real black ice. Then we put in a rope, and everybody went up the rope without any problems at all. Okay, we head down the mountain nearly a month later. The steps were all filled in with loose snow and everything. And Barbara and I, we knew a storm was coming, and we wanted essentially to get the hell off the mountain as fast as we could. So I said to Barbara, I will pay out rope to you, and you've got the job of feeling with your feet down below, and I'll hold you good and tight. Find those old steps, because they were cut in ice, and I knew they would still be there. So Barbara, with great courage, backed off. I put my ice axe in and took a couple of turns around it and let her slowly go out. Well, she went down, I would say, 15 feet or so, and it was blowing snow over down, so she was getting the snow in her face. It was miserable. But so I took a tight turn on my axe of her rope and went over to the edge and looked down. Well, she looked up at me, and she said, damn the son of a bitch, who cut these steps? And I said, I cut those steps. And she said, that goes for you too. Where do you come from?
I'm from Japan.
Japan?
Yes.
Yeah. Koyo Okada, the best mountain photographer.
Yeah.
He did marvelous pictures of Fuji. He spent his whole life taking pictures of Fuji. Okay.
Great, thanks.
My God.
Different angle.
Give him a big kiss.
Yeah,
He's like that.
I've always felt that if Cook had simply said what he and Ed Burrill actually did, he would have been quite a famous explorer in the early days of Alaska. The Cook controversy was sort of a detective story, and the fingerprints were the pictures that showed exactly where Dr. Cook had gone.
It works better going head first.
We're on the way for a landing right beside Dr. Cook's fake peak. In the middle of September 1906, Dr. Frederick A. Cook announced that he had made the first ascent to the summit of Mount McKinley, climbing with young Ed Burrill in a round trip of only 12 days. This allegation of Cook was totally ridiculous, because even with the short climb that McKinley is made nowadays, never takes much less than 15 days. This is March and April 1955. I brought a copy of Dr. Cook's First Ascent of Mount McKinley with me, just for the fun of doing a little outside reading, because I knew we were going to be right in the area where Cook had obviously paraded his little team. And we, with Don's Super Cub, every minute of flying was an hour on the ground on snowshoes. And so he had one picture in the book that I knew was not at 15,400 feet. Well, I'd climbed the darn mountain 3 times, and there wasn't anything that looked like that at all. And we poked around with his airplane like this. We found the thing, and we surveyed from it, and it was 1 mile from Dr. Cook's fake peak. It was 19 miles from the summit, and it was nowhere near 15,000 feet high.
Yeah, there's tracks down there. Now we're going to get the airplane shadow, and I'll tell you when it goes right over this 15,400 foot picture. There, right there. How about that? Got it.
A great many people who did exploration in those days had the illusion that their trip was the last trip that ever would be made to that spot. And my goodness, Belmore Brown, as you know, went in there in 1910, only 4 years later, and duplicated his picture of the summit and proved that he'd gotten nowhere.
Down to there. Yep. Very good.
There.
Welcome back to Glacier 1.
And here we are back at my old pal at Dr. Cook's 15,400 foot point, right up there.
Is that working for you?
Yeah, this is good. Yeah, exactly where we are right now is where in 1906, in September, Dr. Cook took his 15,400 foot picture. And our altitude is almost exactly 5,400 feet high. But we're 19 miles from the top of Mount McKinley right here. Yeah, the fake peak is almost directly above the airplane. And you see there's a snow slope down to the left of it, and it has a vertical rock cliff directly to the left of it in this picture. And they climbed up that steep snow slope, then turned to the right, went right up the crest of that ridge to the fake peak, which is really a very, very easy scramble. And it was all made of the same granite that we're in here, except the granite here is much, much less crumbly and rotten than the granite on the fake peak. The fake peak's just simply falling to pieces. I was quite certain, because of the kind of granite around here, that Cook had been somewhere in this area. And this is in the winter, in March, or early April 1955. Don Sheldon flew me over here, and we got over the glacier in the next valley, and I looked back in this direction and I said, Don, there's Dr. Cook's fake peak, right there. So we circled around and landed here, where we've landed today, walked back up here, and I had a film pack camera, and I wanted to change the film, so I pulled it up, and the paper went down like this, and it landed right on top of one of Dr. Cook's 1-pint fuel tins. And then we kicked around in the dirt here, because there's a little certain amount of dirt here, even in the winter. And there was a food bag, which had represented Ed Burrell's and Dr. Cook's lunch. They came right up the valley here, essentially the way we'd just flown up it. it took them, I imagine, I would guess it was about a 3-hour walk from down near Glacier Point where they had their camp. They stopped here and had lunch, it's perfectly obvious. Then they went down exactly 1 mile and climbed what we all call the fake peak. And that's where Cook took the picture of Ed Burrill on the top of the fake peak. They didn't fool too many people too long. But mainly not so much because of the rock configuration, and we all know there's no rock on the top of McKinley, but it was the nice fluffy snow right in front of them. But you'd never get any higher than perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 feet in Alaska.
I've been here before, and I just marvel at Dr. Cook's enthusiasm for creating a summit that he never went to. I think it's miraculous that he got away with it for so long. And it does look like the top. It could be the top of a mountain, but not Mount McKinley, because Mount McKinley's all white at the summit.
Well, for a great many years, I've been taking aerial photographs, big ones, 8 by 10 inch, out of airplanes in the Alps and all over Alaska. And I've always wanted to have an opportunity to do what I'm doing right now, which is to show you actually how you go about doing it. First thing you've got to do is you've got to be dressed reasonably properly. This is a marvelous old camera that I bought a great many years ago in a second-hand photo place in Los Angeles for $350. And I've had a special Fujinon lens added to it. It's a 12-inch focal length. This is a film magazine, and it sits on the top of the camera. You see it comes off and sets down, and you hitch it on very tightly. Now when this is all clamped into place, to take a picture, I'm now going to lift this up the way I would be flying. And it's quite a handful. This is the marvelous viewfinder. So that if you're taking pictures with this big camera like this, as I stand in the door, sit in the door here, you're getting a beautiful viewfinder that's pretty close to 3 by 4 inches. Now I can talk to the pilot here. I haven't got a mic on now, but I can talk to the pilot and say, get that left wing a little higher. No. Still farther. Right rudder. Good, right rudder. No, pull back on your stick. And in that way, the pilot is framing the picture up to shoot me, rather than me trying to play around with the camera. And this is the way the whole thing works, and it's really not that hard, actually. Back in 1938, I made the first photographic flight all the way around Mount St. Elias and Mount Logan. We had an airplane that didn't have enough fuel in the tank to get us all the way around Mount Logan and Mount St. Elias and back. So what we did was to look out the low tide table. And on the beach at Yakataga, at low tide, you could easily land this big airplane, which was called a Pilgrim. So we found the time of day that it would be low tide, and then we figured out how long our gas would last back to where you started, and we set the time so that as we reached that part of the flight, we'd be running out of gas at low tide at the right place. And it worked to perfection. If the airplane makes a relatively sharp turn to the left, and I want to take a picture virtually straight down, I can lean forward here, and I can't get any farther out, because right behind me I have a chain that keeps me in the airplane, and I'm reaching right down like that, taking a picture straight down. So that it's a system I've worked on for years and years, and all I can tell you is it works. And I'm going to take the top off of it. If I can get it off, it's not too easy. And we'll set it down right beside here. And I want to show you the size of the spool of the film we've got here. Now this takes a 125 8 by 10 inch pictures in a single roll. And I will take this out and show you what, and look at that compared with a little bit of an ordinary roll that carries 36, 35 millimeter pictures. And now if I want to take a picture, all I have to do is to grind that crank and pull the trigger, and that is an 8 by 10 inch aerial photograph. There's nothing like working with a big camera, and I'll tell you why. Ansel Adams, a great friend of mine, the great scenic photographer, and I agreed on one thing in particular: use big negatives to take big subjects. And there's nothing like Mount McKinley or any one of the great peaks of Alaska or the Himalaya when photographed with a camera like this, even though it's a hell of a job to handle it. It's good exercise, too. In 1951, I made my first flight with Don Sheldon. I had a deal to fly in to a survey station that I wanted to set up at the end of Ruth Glacier to check the altitude of the mountain. And the pilot was a guy called Snub Morrison because he had one missing hand. And he came in and I was having lunch at the Fairview Lodge. And he said, would you mind, I've got a lady who's willing to spend $100 to go to Anchorage, and that's a good deal. I want to take her down there, and I have a youngster who's helping me called Don Sheldon, and he'll bring you in. I said, that's great. He was a tail gunner on a B-17 during World War II, and he's learned how to fly, and he's a hell of a good youngster. And we flew in, and I've got to have a wonderful picture of us at home, and a color photograph I took of Don and that airplane, and Don took one of me and that airplane in the same little gravel bar. And in the old days, which is then, before they had their big new gorgeous airport at Talkeetna, the main airport was right up and down the main street practically. But Talkeetna was a tiny little place at that point. We didn't get involved with Don flying, except for that, until I went in there in 1955, when we were mapping the southeast corner of the new map of McKinley, which was published in 1960. And we did a lot of flying for us on that trip. That was when I got interested in Dr. Cook. Because we all knew about Dr. Cook and alleging to have made the first ascent of the mountain.
Solid there? Okay.
Nice sloppy slop. We're
We're talking to you?
parked
To you.
here
Yeah, all right.
on a 5,600-foot landing field right near Don Sheldon's mountain house, behind which, and you'll see in just a minute, Mount McKinley towers about 15,000 feet directly above us. And it's a wonderful time of day to be here. We landed here in the winter of 1955, and we spent a whole month in here mapping this corner of our present Mount McKinley map, which came out in 1960, printed over in Switzerland. We were parked and camped below here on the flats with a magnificent view of Mount McKinley. And after Don Sheldon had died, I suggested to the Board on Geographic Names that they name it after Don Sheldon, Don Sheldon Amphitheater.
Remember when we got almost benighted in here with Don? He landed Betsy and you and me here, and then he got stormed in town, and we were afraid we were going to have to spend the night, but he finally came in and rescued us at the last minute.
We're having a lot of fun here, 50 years later, in this marvelous spot, just enjoying all these same wonderful experiences. The only difference is that every so often we have to stop chatting because an airplane comes in here and lands tourists right here. And these wonderful spots where nobody had ever been before, or hadn't been for many, many years, are now frequented by 2, 3, 4 airplanes every few hours every day.
The one thing you always think about when you're the only girl on a trip is to never cause any trouble, never say you're tired, never complain. You know, naturally, I wasn't going to give up. I mean, with my husband, you know, my job was to keep up, make a good show.
I think up to this time, this was the first really exciting climb of this sort that had ever been made in Alaska. Most of the other big peaks, like McKinley, were lengthy trudges, but this was really ticklish stuff. You can see what Mount Hayes looks like. The lowland foreground here is only about 5,000 feet high, and we're talking about a mountain that is 13,700 feet high, almost 14,000 feet high. It's been tried once before, and the team that tried it 2 or 3 years ahead of us failed quite far down on the mountain. We're now descending into the notch. At the beginning of the camp you see ahead, with this magnificent ridge climbing 3,000 feet up to Hayes's shoulder. There's the summit of Hayes to the left, but it looks way lower than the shoulder, but isn't. I think it was probably lucky that we did have a patch of slightly inclement weather here, which gave us a chance to acclimatize to the 9,000-foot altitude of the camp, so that by the time we were going up onto the peak with the big climb, we were all in really good shape, rested from our long march in, and good sleeping. Here, Barbara's having a horrible time getting snow to melt into water for our cooking. She had a hard time with that one. All the time we lived at this camp was beautiful seas of clouds below us, surrounded by unclimbed, unnamed, unmapped mountains. The first few yards out of that camp were horizontal and deep, loose powder snow. Then the steep ridge began. On a climb like this, the photographer has to do an awful lot more than to climb the mountain once, because you have to dash ahead and take pictures of people coming up toward you, and then wait behind them and have to catch up. The day of the summit climb, it was quite chilly. But I don't think we had any realization of how sharp that little ridge was from the shoulder to the top. I mean, I think that's probably the most exposed little bit of climbing I ever did in my life. There was a section in there where breaking the trail when we went through it the first time. This was an ice ridge like that with about 3,000 feet down on each side, and it had a festoon of snow on top of the ice. The snow would blowing around, and you had to kick that off. And I remember vividly that you couldn't stand on it this way. You had to get your heels and knock the ice and then move it, and then knock the ice and then move gently along. And it was only, 150 feet long, and it was horizontal.
There's one little episode that I remember distinctly about this, and that Brad doesn't remember it at all, is they said to me, now Barbara, you're tied onto the rope and you're light, and if you fall it won't matter, we can hold you. So you walk across this very narrow ridge first, and we'll see how firm it is, and whether the snow is going to drop off. And I remember I was shaking all over, but I thought, I've got to do this, I've got to be a good sport. And I knew that they were going to hold me if I fell.
Like several of the days before this, as the morning progressed, the sun got down into the air around the mountain, and the summit appeared and disappeared through the fog. We were determined to get to the top, though, because I was positive that by afternoon it would all clear off. Every so often it would clear off, then it would cloud up again, and we climbed to the left of the ridge here, on the crest, a lot of it in the fog, looking back down to the shoulder where we'd had that breakfast. Now further and further below. And here we are approaching the summit of Mount Hayes. The boys told us they had a surprise for us here. We were wondering what it was going to be. And all of a sudden they pulled out all sorts of confetti that they'd bought and brought along in a package for this exciting moment, which we all hoped would someday happen. As you can see, it was breezy on top with our National Geographic flag. The Geographic has been helping us on climbs like this for many, many years. Magnificent view down toward the lowlands. Sterling Hendricks, Bill Shand, Ben Ferris, and Barbara, Brad. We were a happy team. The weather in Talkeetna had been very, very unsettled. But early one morning when Barbara and I were having breakfast with Trapper John and Greta Perkins, a burst of sunlight suddenly appeared. I quickly telephoned our favorite young pilot, Erica Bernhardt of K2 Aviation, and said, let's get over to the airport quick. The skies are really clearing this time. The clouds were indeed breaking up. Erica got our powerful little Cessna fueled up, and in a jiffy, oxygen masks ready for use, we were on our way to Mount McKinley, ready to circle around it or even maybe fly right over the top.
As long as you're buckled in, don't
and
ever unbuckle.
you've got some heat up in front.
Yes. Well, you never know. It could be up to 15 below at the summit. So
Never can
we got
tell.
the door off. So
We won't be there for a long time.
not for a long time. Not nearly as long as what you were up there for. How long when you were surveying?
We were there for 2 weeks at
2 weeks.
18,000 feet.
18,000 feet.
I
We
didn't
won't be up
realize.
there that long.
Yeah.
Sometimes I feel like I'm cheating when I'm up there.
Now, the longest time I was ever at 15,000 feet without oxygen was flying all the way around Mount Logan in 935.
There you go. Yeah.
We got all the way around Mount Logan, and the pilot turned to me and said, Brad, where in hell are we?
Yeah.
And I said, you go where I tell you to go.
Exactly. Yeah.
as we emerge from the clouds, Erica, our pilot, and Thom Pollard, our wonderful photographer, are going to coordinate what they are doing to position the camera precisely at the right spot as we approach first the great west buttress of Mount McKinley, and then slowly climb higher and higher over 18,000 foot Denali Pass. And as we approach the summit, I would like to quote John McGee: "High flight, the Royal Air Force pilot. Up, up the long delirious burning blue, I've topped the windswept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent lifting mind, I've trod the high untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God."